Adrian then, who's going to chat to us about sustainable seafood. Am I correct?
Yeah. Now, Sasha and I work together, birds of a feather, I suppose, because seafood is, and its sustainability is really a combination of food and everything that goes with it, and fishing and science. And we kind of cross those boundaries together. Sasha is an amazing chef by trade, and guess I'm a scientist. And we both are in the curious position of loving the oceans, but like so many Australians, we like to eat a little bit of it too. And in doing that, we really want to make sure it's done right. So that's why we have our Good Fish Seafood program, which has two major parts to it. One is producing a seafood guide. That's what I do, which is a lot of scientific analysis of all the seafood that's out there on the Australian market from a sustainability point of view, so that consumers and businesses can choose to use and eat seafood that comes from fisheries that have a really light touch on our oceans. Sasha's restaurant work extends that out and really creates the influence and the pressure on the fishing industry to improve its sustainability, because if they achieve our sustainability standards, that means they can sell their fish to a bunch of chefs and businesses that we can connect them to, and everyone's happy. And the people that are missing out, well, we want them to be less happy, and we want them to work harder and improve their fisheries so they can join us. Yeah, Sasha, if you can skip through the next slide, that would be great. So our seafood guide, you can get it as a Good Fish app. It provides you with a really simple rundown of well over 90% of the seafood that you can get in Australia, the market. And we use a really rigorous and technical scientific analysis to determine whether our seafood is on our green list, amber or red, meaning it's a great choice. Something that's on our green list has very few environmental issues associated with it. Amber is still pretty good, but there's a few things of concern that need to be worked on. And if something's on our red list, then probably the fishery is doing some quite serious damage. It may be a fish stock that's overfished. It might be damaging a sensitive marine habitat, or it might also be catching something like a species that needs to be protected, like one of the sharks that Leo's talking about. If we can skip on. Our Sustainable Seafood Guide looks at 4 really important aspects of sustainability. But before I get into that, I guess I should talk the reasons why we do it, why it's so important, is because sustainability in seafood is the thing. If you ask the fishing industry, then any fish caught in Australia is a really sustainable choice, and we should all be eating more of it. Now, that's unfortunately not quite true. Where we come in is that we don't have an interest either way. We're fully independent of the government, we're fully independent of the fishing industry, and we rely entirely on the trust of Australians, which that means we need to do a really good job of delivering a truly independent take. And it means our supporters expect us to say, if you're going to recommend some seafood to us, it better be really, really sustainable. So that's an important job, and it means we help to sort of set the bar for where our fisheries need to be with regards to the environment. And we'll always keep pushing that bar upwards, and we'll always expect the best, because in Australia, because of you guys, it's pretty mainstream in Australia to love the oceans and demand that they be well looked after. And that's forced the fishing industry and governments to recognise that and put in place some sort of rules and regulations that are pretty much leading in the world. And when I say leading, I mean leading in comparison to a pretty ordinary standard. So it's really important that we keep driving that. To move on to how our guide does that, we look at the 4 really key pillars of what sustainability is. So first, the targeted fish stocks. Okay, that means the actual fish that is being caught. It needs to be a healthy population, and it needs to not be threatened with fishing. And the ideal level for that is about 50 to 60% of the fish left in the water that there would be if no fishing was to happen at all. That gives us a buffer that allows those fish to breed and replace themselves, and also allows a little bit of a buffer for the effects of things we don't understand, like climate change, a bit of insurance there. The next really important part is to look at almost all fisheries catch other stuff too that they don't want to. And we need to make sure those things are healthy. We really don't want to see some of the species of sharks Leo's talking about getting caught, turtles, dugongs, but even things like rare corals, seahorses, that sort of thing. We need to be very careful that they're not being harmed by the fishery. The third really important part is a lot of fishing impacts the seafloor. So, and it happens in a very different way. Like if you're fishing for, say, a crayfish with a cray pot that just drops down to the bottom, crays hop in and you haul it back up to the top the next day, that's a relatively low impact. But something like a trawl net, where a big powerful boat is literally dragging a net with chains across the seabed, directly hoping to lift everything off the seabed and into the net, that can have a really major impact, and we need to consider that really carefully. And the final thing is about the boring stuff, but every good fishery has a whole lot of rules and regulations. We want to make sure those rules and regulations are not only designed to be careful when it comes to the environment, but also that they're well enforced so that the fishermen actually follow those rules. I'm going to move on to like an example of where we're working right now. And that looks at the first thing, the targeted fish stock, and the third thing, which is impacts on the seabed, which are really important. So right now, and this is where I was talking about sort of true sustainability and how the fishing industry will seek to describe everything they catch as perfectly sustainable, because they know that means money. The orange ruffy fishery has just achieved this sustainability certification, what's about to, and that deeply concerns us, and a bunch of our international peers are concerned as well. That's because that certification will enable it to get access to a bunch of supermarkets and fish retailers that demand only the most sustainable fish be on their shelves. And it's a real worry for us, the idea that a fish like orange ruffy, which was fished in Australia and wiped out in the 80s and 90s, pretty much world famous for a bad example of managing a fish stock, it would now be turned around to become one of our most sustainable. So these stories here reflect some of what's going on at the moment and some of our serious concerns. If we flick to the next slide, Sasha, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now, orange ruffy is a protected species, so it's really unusual. That's as a result of overfishing in the past. So it's really unusual that it should be considered also one of our most sustainable fisheries. So that really got us digging. It's on the IUCN Red List. That's in Europe, but it's actually in the same amount of trouble here in Australia. While it doesn't have that category of protection, it's still considered a protected species by our government. And if you look at this graph that I've got here, you can see this blue squiggly line, which is the state of the orange ruffy fish stocks over time. Now, down along the bottom is what's happened in the past and what's predicted to happen in the future. So back in the late 80s and 90s, you can see the fish stock was just about wiped out somewhere between the late 80s and early 90s. And then it slowly started to rebuild. There's a couple of red lines running across there. The upper one is the one where we would consider that to be a sustainable fish, a sustainable population, I suppose. And the bottom one is the absolute worst condition. That's complete ecological collapse. So it's recovered somewhat. Here we are in 2020. But if you look at it, it's actually going to dip again slightly for about the next 20 years. And that's what's amazing about that. So this is an orange ruffy as a fish that can live. Individuals live to be over 250 years old. They're over 30 years old by the time they even start breeding. And so that dip again that we'll see in the next 20 years is actually a result of the overfishing back in the 80s and 90s. So if we get it wrong again now, we will see those impacts 30 years from now. That's incredible. And looking at even the kind of best case predictions for where the fishery might go, even by 2070, this fish stock is not predicted to recover to the level that we would say is actually sustainable. And that is quite remarkable and really disturbing. So that has us out in the media campaigning really strongly to encourage our friends to say, hey, let's not give this fishery the sustainable certification. It is just not ready. We'll skip on to the next one, Sasha. What's fascinating about orange ruffy and where they're caught is they're caught on undersea mountains. Now, Australia's biggest mountain ranges are all under the sea. These ones were recently mapped in this beautiful detail by the CSIRO. And these mountains rise some of them are about 1.5 kilometres high, and they come up to about 700 metres below the surface. And each winter, the orange ruffy aggregate at the very peaks of these mountains to breed. And that's when they get fished. So most of these seamounts have actually been fished already. And we'll skip forward a slide again and we'll show you what's on these seamounts.
We're only play that one for you, mate? Or?
Yeah, that'd be great. Play that video. We're only really beginning to understand because we've only not long had the technology to be able to have a really good look at these seamounts and what's going on there. And if this video ever plays,
let me see if I can open it out in. There we go.
Yeah, you can sort of see it anyway. But these seamounts have these amazing coral reefs on them. It's basically like the Great Barrier Reef in the dark down there. And these seamounts are down around the south and east of Tasmania. Really cold water, super deep.
Sorry about that, guys. It's never going to work out for us, was it?
So hard to do these things. Anyway, we'll stick to the photos. You can see, though, that's covered in coral. And I've got some pictures alongside. And if you look at that top one, you can see this really biodiverse, really like structurally complex coral reef. It looks just like something you'd see on the Great Barrier Reef. And below it, you can see exactly the same areas on the tops of the seamounts of Tasmania that have been fished for orange ruffy. And none of that is there. It's been completely removed. Over 90% of those corals, we now know, are destroyed. Now, those corals, an individual coral down there can be up to 2,000 years old. That's incredible. We should be looking after that stuff. And so it's deeply concerning that a fishery like the orange ruffy might claim to be really sustainable while doing that sort of damage. And now, if you look at the picture on the bottom, that shows us a seamount that is still being fished, and there's just nothing there. The middle one, however, shows a seamount that was fished and then protected from fishing about 5 or 10 years, I think, before that photo was taken. And it looks a lot more like the bottom than it does the pristine coral reef that hasn't been affected. So that's super concerning to us. If you can skip forward a slide again, Sasha. In their claims for sustainability, and this is a real part of my job, is scrutinizing this stuff and make sure it stacks up. The certification for orange ruffy that worries us so much made this really bold claim that the commonly encountered habitats in the fishery would all recover within 5 to 20 years, and that it's highly likely that irreversible harm is occurring to any of them. Now, I looked at the science they used to back that up, and they used a study of a whole bunch of international bottom trawl fisheries, including a scallop fishery that used to operate in Port Phillip Bay off Melbourne, and even studies based in the intertidal zone off Holland for something called lugworms. I actually don't know what a lugworm is. It doesn't seem very appetizing. But these environments are very, very different to a coral reef on a deep sea seamount. And so a big part of my job is to call that stuff out. If we skip forward another slide, what's really annoying about this is that there have been these really amazing detailed scientific studies of the same seamounts that are actually fished. But in this argument that orange ruffy fishing is sustainable, none of that science was actually used or referred to at all. What that science says, I've just got a couple of, these are the names of the scientific papers: little evidence of benthic community resilience to bottom trawling on seamounts after 15 years. Seamount mega benthic assemblages, that's science word for big coral reefs, failed to recover from trawling impacts. It's pretty compelling and condemning that these habitats are seriously, irreversibly damaged. Now, studies even 20 years after trawling stopped on seamounts and they were protected for orange ruffy fishing show that 20 years later, at best, a 1% rate of recovery, and that we can only expect to see those seamounts return to any state of their health at least after several decades. Now, that's just not sustainable. There are so many fisheries in Australia that don't catch species that belong on the endangered species list, and they don't damage coral reefs that contain animals that are thousands of years old. And it's really important that the Australian consumer knows they have that choice, because that choice is really powerful. By choosing seafood and refusing to eat seafood based on its environmental sustainability from an informed science-based point of view, you can really drive a lot of change as to the practices that are out there. So we can encourage the fisheries that aren't doing this damage to seamounts, and we can, we may even need to put a stop to some fisheries, or at least protect these seamounts, protect all the ones that we know of that still haven't been damaged, and ensure they're protected forever, because it's clear that if they are fished, they're going to be irreparably damaged. If we can move on again, Sasha. To show you an example of a fishery that we actually do think is really sustainable, and something that really surprised me, because my sort of gut reaction is that all fishing that drags nets over the seabed has got to have a really high impact. And I would need to see a really good science case in order to be convinced that these fisheries were sustainable. What we have here is the Spencer Gulf prawn fishery. That occurs in Spencer Gulf in South Australia, of course. And it's on our green list. And, you know, we required a good, careful look. If we skip forward a slide, we'll sort of show you some of the things why it might look like a fishery that's...
Well, I think we're going to try and show you, but
yeah, we'll try. No promises.
This is all the testing in the world doesn't necessarily get you there.
This is footage that Sasha himself shot on his phone while doing some filming with one of these boats.
All right. It's not going to work, but I think there might be another way to get these if you can.
Yeah, it's okay, Sasha. I think, gee, this happens all the time. You try to liven up your presentation with some videos.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think that's going to be a no-go for us today.
What a shame. But suffice to say that in that trawl fishery, they catch about between 2.5 and 5 times the amount of prawns they catch is other stuff they don't want to catch, bycatch. Now that's a lot, and that is pretty concerning. So what we've done to be confident that that fishery is sustainable is look at the records of everything they catch and ensure that there's nothing there that is endangered, nothing there that is getting pushed towards extinction. And in fact, most of those species are really well accounted for, and they're caught in other fisheries that have sustainable stocks with science on them. So that gives us a great deal of confidence. Now, these guys they know that bottom trawling is an impacting activity, and there's only so much you can do to reduce that. But what they have done is they've worked out a way where they all fish together to reduce the area they fish each year. So they have a footprint that covers only about 30% of the seabed that they used to catch the same amount of prawns each year. And that means they just leave more of the Spencer Gulf alone. They've also closed off any areas they've identified with important sensitive habitats and marine life in them. They've just closed those to fishing altogether, so they just don't go there. By doing that, it's a relatively simple means to make sure that they leave, they have some impact clearly, but they make sure that they leave everything they can sensitive and vulnerable well alone. And that is really quite a wonderful thing, because it took them years to do that. It took a lot of money, and they did it because consumers demanded. They wanted to eat prawns, but they wanted to eat prawns that weren't damaging the ocean, and they grasped that opportunity and are able to provide them. So, that's really good news. That sort of segues on to Sasha's work, which is all about creating the power and influence that makes the things I do with my science hat on turn into real environmental protection. Because these days, just having the evidence that something needs to change is not enough. You actually need to send a clear signal, and the way we're doing it is through the marketplace. So let's move on, and I'll let Sasha take over from here.